Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Josie's Point of View, where we focus on human interest stories from the Carolinas and beyond. Today's Friday and it's February the 14th, 2025. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're new to my channel, I want to thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you find the information here to be informative. And if you're a return viewer, by all means, thank you for coming back. I always say the tide changes so frequently here on these YouTube streets. So you always have to acknowledge where your support comes from. And I want you to know I sincerely thank you for your support. Feel free to like and to share this video. And don't forget to subscribe. Today's video is an introduction of the 3rd Fort Liberty soldier who's currently on death row. So I'll provide you with a summary here, and as always, I'll identify some of my sources for you in the description box. So this is my 3rd video in this series looking at military service members, specifically from Fort Liberty, who are currently on death row. And this series was triggered by a news publication I saw recently, and it stated that the outgoing President Joe Biden had inaccurately stated there were 40 people on death row and that he had commuted the sentence of 37, that he had commuted their sentence to life in prison. But the number mentioned was not correct because there are 4 additional service members on death row, and they were not counted, and they also were not considered for presidential pardon. So I decided to do some research of my own. I wanted to explore to find out who these service members were and what they had done to get them on death row in the first place. Now, these are the facts. Military data on death row inmate states as follows. 1. The military has not carried out an execution since 1961. Currently, there are 4 service members awaiting execution, and 3 of them are from Fort Liberty here in North Carolina. And of the 3 from Fort Liberty, we've already covered 2 of them, these 2 pictured here. The most recent was a Private Hassan Akbar, and he was sentenced to death row in 2005. And it was because of his activities at the beginning of the second Iraq War in 2003 when he was mobilized in Kuwait, and some of the things that he did with his unit and resulted in service members being intentionally killed. So that was in 2003, and he was placed on death row in 2005. And the other individual is Private Ronald Gray. Now, he was sentenced back in 1987, and he's the oldest service member on death row. And as you can see, both of these service members are Black. They're Black Americans, yes, but the 3rd individual is not. But let's get started with our video today and find out what acts that individual had committed and what got him on death row in the first place. And I do want to begin this video with a bit of a cautionary note. The content will address information that was presented at a soldier's court-martial, and some of it may be a bit triggering to some of my viewers. I want to remind each of you to approach with a bit of caution. If for some reason you become anxious, I want to encourage you to log off at any time, and remember, you can always return at a later date and pick up where you left off. Now, it took me a very long time to get this video together. It was much more work involved than I anticipated, but I want to highlight 2 very, very important sources that were very instrumental to me. The first was this article by the New Yorker, and the title of it was 3 Trials for Murder, and the date on it was November the 6th, 2021. And then the second source, which was by far the most valuable, the title of the source was Military Justice for All. And I'm including it because even though I'm not endorsing any particular news source, I don't think I would have been able to really produce a comprehensive video without looking at these resources. So the focus of this video is on Private Timothy Hennis, and it goes back to a situation that took place back in 1985 when he was around 28 years old, and it took this case almost 3 decades to achieve a conviction. But back in 1984, Sergeant Timothy Hennis was a parachute rigger assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Now we call it Fort Liberty. And at that time, he had been in the Army for just about 4 years. He was married at that time, and he was the father of a very young daughter. Now, back then in 1985, a very tragic situation took place in the city of Fayetteville, and it became known as the Eastburn murders. Now, on May the 9th, 1985, an Air Force spouse was found brutally RAPED and murdered in her Fayetteville, North Carolina home. Her husband had been away at the time. Now, two of her three children were also murdered in the same vicious way. All three had been stabbed multiple times, and their throats had been slashed. Now, your youngest daughter was found dehydrated but unharmed in her crib, and she was the only one to have survived. Now, the picture here is of the adult victim, Catherine Eastburn, and I'm deciding not to show any pictures of the deceased children. And Timothy Hennis became a prime suspect very early in the investigation. Here's why. Now, a few days before the murders, Catherine, the deceased adult victim, had placed an ad for a dog for sale. She was trying to sell a dog, and she had placed an ad in the newspaper that was covering Fort Bragg and Pope Air Force Base. Now, the family was preparing to move overseas, and she just wanted to make sure that, someone wanted to give the dog a decent home. And one of the people responding to that ad on May the 7th was Timothy Hennis, and he was driving a white Chevy Chevette, and that's important. Now, after the victims were discovered, a neighbor drew a sketch of a person that she saw at the house around the time of the murders, and that sketch looked very much like Hennis. And the neighbor also stated that the person that she saw or he saw was driving a white Chevy Chevette. There was also mention of a black members only jacket, and they found that Hennis had one of those, but when investigators caught up with him, it was at the cleaners. Now, keep in mind back then DNA was not available, so that was a key piece of information that was missing at the time. And also, the victim's ATM card had been used for the maximum amount allowed on 3 different times, totaling the amount that Hennis paid for his rent, which was late. And he was known to have had money problems because he had prior convictions for writing bad checks at least 3 different times. And again, another eyewitness identified the person that they saw at the ATM machine using that card to be Timothy Hennis. And would you believe it? It was Hennis's wife, after seeing the sketch of a person of interest. She was the person who encouraged Timothy Hennis to go in and speak with investigators because the sketch looked just like him. And investigators say he answered questions, but he was impatient and he was very arrogant. But it was a lengthy interview, after which he consented to go, and he gave blood, saliva, and hair samples, and he was also fingerprinted. And of course, he denied being at the house after he purchased that dog. But remember, there was an eyewitness who encountered him on the day of the murder, and that person was able to look at several pictures and positively identify Timothy Hennis from a picture shown, and later that day he was arrested at his home. So, with all of that evidence stacked against him, Timothy Hennis was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of RAPE back in 1986, and the state of North Carolina put him on trial for those crimes. And even though he was an active duty soldier, he was tried in the Cumberland County courts and the civilian courts because the military did not have jurisdiction in the case, and that's because the crimes took place outside of the base in Cumberland County. Now, before the trial was to begin, Hennis was offered a plea deal. He would plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder with a likely sentence of 2 consecutive life sentences, but he refused, electing to stand trial instead. And that summer, which was the summer of 1986, Timothy Hennis went on trial for the murder of Catherine Eastburn and her 2 young daughters. Reports say he maintained his innocence throughout the trial. It was reported that after all of the evidence had been presented, the jury deliberated for approximately 10 hours before finding him guilty. They found him guilty on all counts, 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of RAPE. And a few days later, Timothy Hennis was given the death sentence. And things were about to get very interesting for Hennis and his team. They were successful in getting the Supreme Court to hear their case in 1988. His attorneys argued that the numerous graphical scene videos used by the prosecution that had been shown to the jury, they felt that had unduly influenced the jury against the defendant, talking about Hennis. They also called into question a lot of the eyewitnesses and their testimony, and their arguments were successful because the Supreme Court issued a verdict on a margin of 5-2 in favor of a new trial. And that was the first time ever in North Carolina that a prisoner on death row had been granted a new trial. And 1 year later, in April of 1989, Hennis did get that new trial. By this time, the prosecution team had changed, and the impact was not as effective as it was for the first case. This time, Hennis was acquitted on all charges. Yes, he was found not guilty on all charges. So now he went from death row to being a free man. And based on the double jeopardy rule, it meant that Timothy Hennis could never again be charged for that crime. Or that's what we thought. So Hennis went from being a prisoner on death row to now being a free man. And against the advice of his attorneys, he made a decision to return to the military. So he enlisted and he resumed his military career. Eventually, he had 2 more promotions and he had 2 combat related tours, one to Afghanistan and one to Somalia. And then he relocated his family to Seattle, Washington, where he eventually retired from military service in 2004 at the rank of Master Sergeant. So after this second trial in 1989, he served almost 15 years before he eventually retired. But I hope you don't really think this case was over. You know, back in Fayetteville, North Carolina, the murders of these 3 residents had been unsolved and it had gone into the cold files, but they were definitely not forgotten. With the passage of time, there were more recent advances in crime detection technology, which were absent during the trials. And in the spring of 2005, the Cumberland County Police Department, their members attended a seminar that shed light on the former case and addressed the evidence that they had collected that still had not been examined, and hence the introduction of DNA testing. So that's where they got their knowledge. So they returned home and utilized that knowledge to test the existing specimens and had positive results. There was a match. The specimens that had been taken from the victim's body at the scene of the crime, they were a perfect match with the samples collected from Timothy Hennis. I'm sure there was excitement at the finding, but there was also a dilemma for police because this man had already been tried twice and he fell under that double jeopardy rule, which said that they said the double jeopardy clause of the Fifth Amendment protects people from being tried twice for the same crime. The clause applies to criminal cases, civil sanctions, and juvenile court proceedings. Now, he had already been tried on 2 different times. First one was thrown out. The second one, he was found not guilty. So their hands were tied. And I'm sure they were reaching out to Fort Bragg saying, you know, we've got evidence. We've got evidence that he most likely had something to do with these killings. But what are we going to do about it, or what are you going to do about it? And Fort Bragg came up with the solution. So there was a strategy that they could now use. And it says that the United States Constitution dual sovereignty doctrine. And essentially it says that even though someone has been tried for a crime at the state level, they can still be tried at the federal level because they're 2 separate levels of government. So with that information now in hand, they petitioned Fort Bragg commanding general to bring him back and have him face a general court-martial, and the post commander consented. And Hennis was recalled to active duty on September the 26th, 2006, and in September of 2007, the same commanding general ordered that he stand trial for murder. And of course, a few more years had gone by because there were several appeals because He did not feel, or his attorney said that the military did not have the jurisdiction to call him back to active duty, but those appeals were denied. So a lot of time had passed, and then there was preparations for trial. So when the court martial began, it was now 2010, and it was over 20 years since that first case. Hennis looked a whole lot different. After all, he was now 49 years old, and during the 3 week trial, DNA evidence was introduced, of course. Specifically, they had extracted semen from the victim's body, and the prosecutor was able to convince the court that the only person who could have left that semen was the killer, and the specimen matched the DNA of Timothy Hennis. And Hennis's attorneys, they alluded to a sexual relationship between Hennis and the deceased victim, and that's how they were trying to justify the presence of the semen. But I'm sure no one really believed them. But once again, the evidence was compelling, and at that court martial, Timothy Hennis was found guilty of premeditated murder, and on April the 15th, 2010, he was sentenced to receive the death penalty. And as required by law, his attorneys have submitted several appeals, all of which were denied, and his sentence has been upheld. And finally, in 2021, the Supreme Court declined to hear his case, clearing the way for his permanent place on death row, and so he awaits. And so Timothy Hennis currently awaits his execution date. His permanent residence is the disciplinary barracks, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And as I mentioned previously, there are a total of 3 soldiers from Fort Liberty who are currently awaiting execution. There are a total of 4 soldiers on death row, but 3 of them came from Fort Liberty, formerly known as Fort Bragg. So you have Timothy Hennis, you have Hassan Akbar. He has been there since 1985. And then you have Ronald Gray. He has been there the longest. He's been there for over 30 years. And that's all I have for you right now. Feel free to leave me a comment below and let me know what you think about this video. And by all means, feel free to like it and to share it. And if you haven't done so already, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel by clicking on that red subscribe button. It's on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And if you click on the bell that looks just like this one, that's the notification bell. If you click on that notification bell, you'll be the first to know whenever a new video is uploaded. I thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.